Again, Daniel is our frequent presenter, and I know that he is a software developer from independent company in Germany, Materna, who actually builds and consults other people how to create decision management systems. And I know that Daniel is a very quiet person, and somehow he manages to generate the most questions, and he always creates controversies. I hope he will do it again. Daniel.
Thank you, Jacob. Well, we'll see. So yeah, hello everybody. I'm Daniel, a software developer for a German IT company. And I want to talk about something that is, in my opinion, the real key feature of DMN, and that's the decision requirement level. So first of all, we'll talk a bit about us, an introduction, and then how we use or how we build the DRL and especially the DRD. And then I want to discuss what's missing, in my opinion, to make it even better, and what's the message. So first of all, the motivation. In the last years, we talk a lot about the execution, about how to write logic, and I wanted to concentrate on something that hasn't been in the focus, in my opinion, as far, and that's the DRL, and especially, and that's some kind of thanks to Alan, the integration of DRDs into DMN. Because in my opinion, it's a huge advantage and benefit for business users to have all their decisions in one place at a DRD. So yeah, some words about the Materna. We are a German IT company with projects for airports, logistic, automotive, and the sector I work for is the public sector, where we mostly do custom authority projects. Yeah, there I work as a software developer with Java EE projects and rule-based projects like IBM, ODM, or rules. So the general structure of DMN, when you think of DMN as a sphere, on the outside, in my opinion, you have the DRD. You have the decisions, you have the input, and what's important, you have also a part of the documentation of the whole thing with knowledge, with text annotations. In the second layer, there are the item definitions where you define your data types, your complex item definitions. And these are the basic for the logic in the center of the sphere. And there you have all these decision tables, box expressions, field, all the things we talked about. But I want to focus on the outside layer and how it's useful for business analysts. So how is our model of generating the DRD? First of all, you must have a main decision, and in most projects, there's some kind of business model behind, a BPMN model where you have a decision task, and that's the first start point of your main decision. The second thing that also comes from the outside is the input data. So what information do I need to make this decision? Then, and that's the important part, you have the sub-decision. So you have your input data, and how do you get from your input data to the result of your main decision? And you do it by separating in many or a lot of sub-decisions, which can be answered all by themselves. And the answer itself lies in the logic, as I talked with Phil. So how exactly is the logic implemented? But as I mentioned, this is the crucial part at the beginning to understand what's the main requirement you have with your decision. And therefore, you have a lot of iterations between sub-decision and your logic. For example, as Dennis mentioned, when your box contexts get too complicated, that's an indicator that your sub-decision is perhaps too large or too complex as a question you want to answer with this. And so you have to separate this, and that something goes back and forth. And during all this process, you have to document your decisions. And that's crucial for everything you make, not just for the logic, not just for the input, but everything has to be documented, especially if you work in a group that other people understand your logic. So yeah, the main decision, as I mentioned, it comes from the process model. But as some mentioned, there are also sometimes projects that don't have a real process behind it, but there's a rule decision you have to be make. And there also you must have one decision. And this must be a complex decision because otherwise it's not worth the effort to make the whole overhead with DRDs and everything. And yeah, it's mostly represented by one or just a few decisions in the DRD. And that's important because if you have too many decisions that describe your main decision, there's a chance that you didn't understand the real question you want to ask because it's too large. So the inputs, they are defining the data structure. And as you know, they are represented in the DRD by the input data elements. And these first two steps, the information therefore comes from the outside. That's the border you get from the outside for your DRD and for your decision model. So the subdecision, that's the crucial part, because when you have your main decision and your input, then the question is, how do I get to this main decision? And therefore I have to answer a lot of different other questions, which represents some subdecision. Something may be a BKM. But most of the time you go from your course decision and get always finer and finer until you have answered your main question. And if you have trouble creating this model, it usually shows that you have not understood the specific question you want to answer. And so that's a good indicator whether you understand your requirements, really. So yeah, then the logic describes how your decision is implemented. And as mentioned before, there might affect also your subdecisions because you want to change the focus of them. So the last and I think a very important step is the documentation, because it describes in one place in your DRD where come the information from, which laws are affected, and it's all in one place. So you don't have the need for much other papers, other documents. It's all in one place, represented by knowledge sources and text annotations. Yeah, and to give a small example, unfortunately, I can't show a DRD from one of our projects. So I have the example of chapter 11. So this is your main decision you want to make about the strategy, and you have your two input data. And from there, and that's what we see in most of our projects, people start modeling from the input data. So they have something in their hand and they can work with to ask the next question, what do I need? We don't see a lot, because we had this discussion 2 days ago, from the top down. But what we see is something like a mixture, therefore. They start at the bottom of the diagram, then go up with one pass, and later on add the other elements. And during all this modeling, it's important to make your business knowledge and your text annotations to document what are these subdecisions for, where do they come from, and what's the real need for them. So what's missing? And just to put it out there, it's not much, and most of the ideas are more things specific to the vendors of the tools, for the modeling tools. So one thing, and that's more a general, let's say, problem, in my opinion, is the need for a graphical representation of item definitions. And I think it's something that's also needed in BPMN diagrams with data objects. Every tool vendor has its own way to model item definitions, and especially there's also a need to document these item definitions. And therefore, in my opinion, there's a general need for a graphical description of these elements. Yeah, specification of the name of the item definition. This is a little special wish. When we work with our customers, we often see the problem that when we work with the DRD and discussing it, it's sometimes helpful to see the item definition that comes out of one subdecision. And I know you have this when you have a result box, and then you must have also defined the item definition therefore. But that's something we find really helpful when we are just looking at the DRD and not always switching into a decision to see what's the input data there. Yeah, and the last point, structured display option. This is something I, for myself, don't have a real answer of how to do this, but we see sometimes a lot of text just in one text annotation or in a knowledge source without any formatting. And there it would be nice to have some kind of text formatting to make it easier to structure these elements, because otherwise people won't read what's inside them. And so they would get useless and just make the whole diagram a mess. But the most important thing that's missing for me is that my wish is when you change things in the DRD, make it wisely, because it's a huge benefit of a DRD that is simple and that it doesn't have so much different elements. Because in my experience, everybody can understand a DRD quite simple. In my opinion, it's quite harder with a BPMN diagram where you have all these different kind of elements in one diagram. It's a lot harder to understand this, and especially because DMN logic itself is quite hard to understand, and to understand box context and decision tables and everything. It's, in my opinion, necessary that the DRDs are as simple as possible, because these are the entering point for decision management and decision modeling. And therefore, in my opinion, they must remain as simple as possible. So yeah, what's the message? In my opinion, the decision requirement logic is really necessary to understand what's the decision you want to make, and therefore it's really helpful. And with DRDs, which everybody can understand, this is a huge benefit of the DMN standard to have such a diagram. So in general, as one of our customers said, even without executability and without logic and feel and everything, DMN still offers an added value because you understand what's your requirement, basically because of the DRD. And we had the discussion 2 days ago, why is the usage of BPN better than DMN? And maybe it's because we ask too much of DMN. In my opinion, we always want the whole package, we want it executable, we want the whole logic. But the DRL itself is a really good starting point to bring people to think about how they make decisions in their businesses. And from my experience, that's something many people doesn't really understand, how they make decisions. And a DRD helps them to understand this. And yeah, so that's the main message, that it has a huge benefit for business users. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Daniel. We have a number of questions and discussion points going on over on the Slack channel. James Taylor kicked things off. He said that although they sometimes do projects that have well-defined input data, they have almost as many where building the decision model actually drives the input data requirements. And then even when the input data is, quote unquote known, it's wrong. So the decision model reveals that the data required is not what the business thinks it is. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, that's a good point. Because, for example, a BPMN diagram doesn't force people to think that much about the input that goes into a decision. Mm-hmm. I often see there's this data object going in there, and that's it. But when you ask them, what do I really need to make this decision, they start to think, perhaps I need this element and this element. And always there starts a huge discussion right at the beginning.
Right. It's he just added on another question about what percentage of BPMN process models out there are executable, and says probably pretty small, and thinks that the value of non-executable decision models as a documentation should not be underestimated. Certainly my experience with process models is that yes, there's only a fraction of them that are actually executed. So what are your thoughts on this sort of promoting the idea of non-executable decision models in order to gain understanding?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, when I think back how BPMN began with people and other things, people thought I make my diagram and then it's completely executable. And then they realize that's not the truth. And I think it's the same with DMN. People think, oh, I make this diagram and then I have an executable decision. Mm-hmm. And that's not the point. But I think James a few days ago told us there's a decision documenter. And I think that these people exist just because many businesses don't have a documentation of how they make a decision. Mm-hmm. They might have a documentation of how they process work, but not of their decision.
That's a very good point. So James also said that asked if you try to find the BKMs, the business knowledge models at the beginning, they focus on sub-decisions and knowledge sources instead to elicit the models. But how are you doing that?
I think I don't get the question. Oh, a knowledge source hierarchy. No, not at all. As James asked, what do you look for BKMs? There have been a long learning path dealing with BKMs. So in general, and I would say it also today, it's reusable decisions. Because I think that's the easiest way to describe what's a BKM for. And so the business users search for decisions they're using in different subdivisions or something like that, and then they say, this is a BKM. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's a tricky point. What's really a BKM to tell this to people?
Okay, Matteo has a good question here about DRDs. It seems that everybody agrees that DRD is a key feature of DMN, but when we had the practitioners panel on Monday, it was pointed out that this was one of the most difficult things to onboard business analysts with. So what has been your experience at Materna in training on DMN DRDs to make them say, oh, now we get it, the business analyst being able to say, oh yeah, now we get DRDs. How do you get them to that point of knowledge?
At the beginning, we tried to teach them DMN and all these elements. And then we noticed that's too much for the people, for most people. And so we started with simple elements like rectangle box and asked them, what do I need for this decision? And without telling them that this is DMN and this is a DRD, they make exactly these diagrams. So they have no BKM or something like that. But these diagrams, without telling them you are painting a DRD, are exactly what we need. So now we try to teach them more how could you separate your difficult decision into sub-decision and then model this.
Okay, it's James had a comment about how about your comment on documenting decisions, that what they find is that every time they build a decision model is they get asked by the domain experts if they can then keep that decision model to teach new people. So they find that the decision model is actually a better representation of what they do than the policy manual or the checklist.
Yeah,
are you finding that as well?
Definitely, yeah. We had a slightly different experience. So in one of our projects, the DLD and the logic was given to the software developer who has to implement it. And for software developers, it's sometimes hard to understand that you just have a top-down view on the whole decision, because that's not always the way they think in models and so on. But for the business people, it's always the DLD they want to show, and not the whole documentation or prosa or what they write there for.
Okay. Bob Moore said that as he understood the problem with analysts and DRDs is that a lot of analysts don't actually try to understand. They're translators of requirements. They're not really analysts. So it's like maybe it's a misnomer. Or do you find that within your organization? Is that some of the analysts are really just there to document things and not to and to translate and not really to do analysis?
Yeah. And therefore we are thinking about a role, something like a rule designer or decision designer that helps the business people to document and model their decision, but it's not their job to do a real analyze. But what we see is that when people start thinking about how they make the decision because they have the knowledge, they are the best analysts by themselves, because then they notice things I do there aren't really necessary, or I don't know why 2 years ago we made this and this. And so they can, in some part, analyze their models by themselves.
Mm-hmm. Denise said that the OMG BMI group is working on a situational data model and notation, an SDMN, to address some of your issues. And then Ulrich responded and said this was also a question about whether process-wide constraints would not be better specified at the item, and that this is what SDMN offers. So I'm not as familiar with all of these standards, so I don't know if you have any particular comments on that.
I hope that there's something coming up in the next years, because I think this is a real weak point looking at the data. Because the data is everywhere, it's in the process view, it's in the decision view, but there is no graphical representation of it. And so it's always in one or the other diagram, but there's no central point where you have to model it.
Jacob asked, so as a consultant, if you don't go to the BKM level, how do you manage to understand their problem yourself?
Good question. In some point, it's the experience we have with the subject and the field by ourselves. And we are doing a lot of retrospective to find exactly these key points with the customers. But yeah, okay. As James said, the BKM is not the fact you need to understand. A BKM is, for most people, a decision that comes from the outside.
Right.
And so that's, in my opinion, a way many people understand it.
And Jacob, you asked to elaborate. Were you asking James to elaborate, or are you asking Daniel to elaborate? You can.
If the agreement was.
Sorry, go ahead.
If Daniel and James are in agreement that we don't have to understand the problem, we don't have to go to BKM level. So I would be happy to hear how you understand it.
You have to, in some point, you have to go there, but we try to keep it out at the beginning. So yeah, but there's some point you need to do this, because otherwise you get a real mess of duplicated decision and so on. But in our experience, don't start with BKMs.
Okay, so it seems like there's certainly some agreement about that with Carol Ann and James both agreeing that you would not start with the BKM. And Alan points out that they're not required so much to understand the problem, but to understand the implications for the implementation.
Yeah.
So that maybe aren't required until further down the line.
Yeah.
Okay, it sounds like Daniel does not create controversies this time, so I will.
Sorry.
So I will. I've seen many times situations when our consultants came after already high-level consultants spent 2, 3 weeks or 4 weeks, and they had all nice diagrams. And when, then they left, and customers had no idea what to do next. So when we came with trying to go to the next level, and of course we were invited because we can implement it, in majority of cases we've seen that people who provided these consulting results, they did not understand the problem, and we had to do it from the very beginning. Sorry, but this is kind of a real world experience.
So James, you obviously have a lot of real world experience in here. You're sort of putting in some of the thoughts that you have. If you want to unmute yourself, you could just give us a little bit of a précis of what you do and how this works in your practice.
Sure. Yeah. So we find 3 to 4 weeks is plenty to get the whole thing done. And we'll build a detailed DRD, much as Daniel was saying. Sometimes a little bit of bottom up, but we try very hard to get people to think top down. You know, playing all sorts of sort of elicitation games to try and get it done. And we can generally drive out the full structure of a DRD in a few days, working directly with the business domain experts, and then a few weeks enables us to capture the decision logic. And we just capture the decision logic, you know, as sort of, you know, generally as non-executable, you know, sort of natural language sort of artifacts, but, you know, using the same, you know, primarily decision tables to capture most of that logic. And by the end of 3 or 4 weeks, we have essentially, you know, almost all of the core business logic captured. And then what's left is mostly sort of fairly technical. How do we move the data around? Where do we have iteration? Where do we have, you know, what's the, you know, the sort of plumbing, if you like, that you have to do? And whether that gets done in a BRMS or it gets done in Feel or so on, depends on the implementation platform that a client's picked. But we don't find that first few, you know, a few weeks at the beginning there is more than enough to drive from a top-down DRD into a very detailed DRD. I mean, you know, we do like an auto originations DRD. It had 110 subdecisions. You know, I mean, a decision logic for all those subdecisions, and you know.
I think what's important is that the
description of it, yeah,
that the customer itself is at least able to read these documents by themselves, and it would be way more better if he's able to model them by themselves. And that's something we try to teach them, even if they don't understand the whole field with, I know, recursion and something like this. They have to be able to understand and model the DRDs.
Okay, well, great discussion. I know we're running a little bit early, but we started early. It seems that there's still a little bit of discussion going on in the Slack channel. Not so much questions, but more clarifications on points. So definitely hop over there and continue the conversation.